Welcome to tonight's edition of Resource PNG. On the show, we hear from key players in the LNG sector, a global LNG expert and the Managing Director of Esso Highlands, Peter Graham. We also speak with the International Finance Corporation. But first, let's join Anya Geno in an interview with the Chairman of FACS Global Energy, Dr. Feridun Fesharaki, a global LNG expert.
I have with me today Dr. Feridun Fesharaki, the Chairman of FACS Global Energy, a global expert in LNG. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, Doctor, at the moment there are 2 trains under construction. What are the prospects for a 3rd train?
Well, the big expenditure of funds taken place already on the 2 trains is 80% complete, so adding a 3rd train would be cost effective. The issue is to find the resources for that. There are already identified quite a bit of resources for the train 3, but maybe not 100% as yet. This is mainly in the area called Png Lng, where there are substantial resources available. More reserves need to be proven, and once there is a full understanding that there is enough resource, then we would be looking at a 3rd train. The 3rd train may not be able to provide a long-term supply, maybe a shorter term,
Right.
but its cost effectiveness is very high since the big infrastructure already has been built in the first 2 trains.
Now, there are recent exploration efforts around the country finding gas. Is it possible that we will have a 2nd LNG project, and who do you think the contenders would be?
Well, there are quite a few areas in PNG which are under exploration. There are areas which have been explored by Talisman and partner Mitsubishi with Horizon. There are areas which is being explored by Oil Search and partner international major Total. And of course there are more activities being done by existing players around the country. So the key issue is, do we find enough volume to put into a new project? On top of that, we also have the 2 big discoveries on the fields called Elk and Antelope, which are by Interoil. And Interoil has been looking to try to develop a project separately, but now is looking for tenders for various people to buy in and become a partner with them. The issue in Papua New Guinea, I think, is that there is room for new projects, but we should not get overexcited thinking that Papua New Guinea could be as big as Australia, for example. Papua New Guinea would still be a reasonably small player, but there is room to double the existing volume, or maybe even triple with time. The key question is aggregation, that how do you aggregate these resources which belong to different people, which are across the country. And in PNG, the logistics is the #1 challenge, not just collecting all the gas from different resources, but all the landowner issues which need to be tackled as diplomatically and as well as a PNG LNG has handled it. So yes, there are prospects, I think, for a 2nd LNG project. It has to include everybody else, and most importantly, it would have to be tied in with those who will participate in a partnership with Interoil. I think without Interoil assets, doing a 2nd LNG project is not possible.
Right.
But with that and with aggregation of that is possible. Who are the contenders? There is a secret list of the bidders, which is not public. But one assumes that all the big players are there. One assumes that ExxonMobil would be there, Total, Oil Search would be there, perhaps Shell would be there, maybe even Chevron, we don't know. The list of the contenders would be in there with Interoil, and they have to decide what they want to do. Of course, the license for the operation of Interoil would come up for review in 2015, so they need to make a decision earlier on. I'm not sure with 2014 or 15. So it cannot be continued for a long time. It has to be, decision needs to be reached. But the mode of the operation, the role of the international player is very important. The government has made it clear that they would like another big player, either the same big player, ExxonMobil, or another big player the same size, to make sure that the project gets developed. These projects are so big that the small players simply cannot do it. And I think this is the right policy, the government policy, the right policy to look for another big player to be able to bring this together. But you have to have a combination of the right players, enough resources, and the willingness of different partners to cooperate with each other. And the role of government here is very important because the government has the final key, and that the key is the license renewal. The government can use the license renewal to try to ensure that a project is formed. And although the role of the government has been to be very careful in terms of allowing the people enough time to be able to do their investment and policies based on economics. But if the different people are not able to get together in a timely fashion, that is a loss to the assets of the country.
Right.
And I think that the government intends and should rightly drive this ship towards a destination. And I'm hopeful that this will happen very soon.
Doctor, you've been travelling to this country over some years now, and you've obviously had some experience with issues and barriers in this country. Do you think licensing is an issue in this country?
I think the licensing is important, but it is, when the government gives a license, it gives you a certain amount of time to develop it. And if you sit on the license and you don't develop it, the government has the right to say, okay, then I want somebody else to try it. Because you are taking the nation's assets hostage, and it needs to be developed so that the people will benefit. So I think that these are, I think, important tool in the hands of the government to be able to not discourage investment, but to encourage investment, but making it possible to go forward and making it clear that there are limitations on how long you can sit on the assets. And the assets need to be developed in a way which will benefit the country. So I think the license issue is important, and I think the government's policy is the right way to handle it.
We continue with Dr. Feshiraki's interview after the break. In this segment, Dr. Feshiraki tells us what revenues we can expect from the second LNG project. He also talks about the key ingredients required for its development and makes comparisons with other parts of the world.
And what revenues can be expected from the second LNG project, and how large do you think this project might be?
If we look at the current project under construction, there's 2 trains, and it is going to be approximately 7 million tons, a bit under 7 million tons. The 3rd train will bring it to about 10 million tons, 9.5, 10 million tons. The second project size could be somewhere in the range of 5, 7 million tons, a bit smaller than the 3 trains, but enough size. If you don't have enough gas for 2 trains of 5, 6 million tons, most people will not go under construction. So you need to have a minimum size. What kind of revenue would expect? That is very much related to the price of oil, because these projects are pre-sold. And if the price of oil is high, the revenues will be high. If the price of oil is lower, the revenues will be lower. So you can expect perhaps equal to what we are expecting from the 2 trains of PNG LNG to come in as revenues to the country, as job creation, as potential for additional economic boost to the economy. So quite significant to be able to do something and then double the size of it. I think that makes a big difference to the future of PNG.
What are the key ingredients for the development of a second LNG project in PNG?
The key ingredients are the kind of partner which will develop it. In this business, it's the business of the big boys. You have to be really big, you have to have deep pockets, you have to have the technology, and you have to be able to have a customer base that people will trust and buy from you. So it is not for the faint-hearted. It has to be really, really big players. And I think the government's policy of wanting a major player among the top 5 in the world, and we have now the largest company in the world, oil company in the world, ExxonMobil, which is operating the first one. So the second one would have to have either same player or one of the top people to operate. So that is a very important ingredient which is required. Otherwise, the marketing, the technology, and the investment would be facing problems. Second ingredient is that you need to have the resource. Resources are scattered all over the place. So to do that, you need to have a pipeline. To do that, you need to be able to negotiate land ownership issues with the landowners. The government needs to play an active role in making this go forward and give the support to the private sector to be able to develop it. But fundamentally, you need name brand, company, you need assets, and you need active participation by the government.
Now, the PNG LNG project has experienced a cost blowout. How similar or different is it in other parts of the world?
The cost blowout in PNG LNG, about 25%, is actually among the smallest cost blowouts we have experienced in the past couple of years. And in the case of PNG LNG, something like about 60% of the total cost blowout from the beginning to the end will be related to the foreign exchange. That's the increasing value of the Australian dollar and Kina. So the actual blowout by itself was less than half. Right. In Australia, many of the projects have increased by 30-35%. So actually this has been managed quite well. In the scheme of things, it is managed quite well, and the biggest culprit of the increase has actually been the foreign exchange increase rather than the mismanagement of the costs.
Now, in LNG terms, how would you compare PNG's size to the world, and are we going to be a big or a small player?
I think PNG will remain a small to medium-sized player. To give you some numbers to keep in mind is that today the largest exporter of LNG in the world is Qatar in the Middle East. They export 77 million tons. By end of 2014 or middle of 2015, PNG will be exporting about 7. So 10% of the total. If PNG is really successful with the second project, then the total may end up to be 15, 16 million tons, which would be a good medium-sized player, but not in the league of the big boys. Right. Then Australia will become number 1 by 2017-18 at about 80-85 million ton. So the world scene would be something like this: Australia first, Qatar second, and the new market, new supplier will be the United States, would be third. So PNG would be in the rank of the top 10, but key issue is that it is being run by very competent and respectable players, and the world now trusts PNG as a reliable supplier and the government as a reliable partner in making sure the projects go forward.
As a small to medium player, can we expect higher or lower prices?
The price of LNG is linked to the price of oil, and these projects are so huge. When you go borrow the money from the bank insists that you have to have firm sales contract before you come to the bank. So one thing we know is that these projects, PNG LNG is fully sold. And if a third train comes, the third train will be sold before it's commissioned. And if a second LNG project comes, it will be sold before it goes under construction. So the project will be sold. We don't have to worry about not being able to sell it. At what price? You have the big boys and they know how to sell. So roughly, you can think that something like about 80 to 85% of the price of oil would be what the gas price would be. But who can predict the price of oil? We don't know. The price of oil today is $110. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, it was $40. So depending on what the price is, our expectation is that the price will be in the range of $80 to $100 for many years to come. So there will be enough incentive to develop these projects and to bring in pretty substantial revenues for PNG.
Now, the government recently announced that Petromin would be broken up and its mineral and petroleum assets transferred to 2 state-owned companies. Now, the only difference we can see is that the mineral assets and petroleum assets will be managed separately. What real benefits do you see coming from this? And what are the possible problems that might arise from this?
Well, the Prime Minister said in one of the interviews that PNG needs to get organized. I think this is a very important statement, that there are too many bosses for too many assets divided up. His policy is to try and consolidate different assets in different institutions, where the institution is responsible for one thing and they can take care of it. I think this is a very, very positive move. And frankly, I've been expecting that to come for a number of years, and I'm very happy to hear about it now. What we will see is that the petroleum and minerals, they sound the same, but they're actually very different industries. Different nature, different operator, different players. If you look at gold and copper, silver, they're similar, but oil and gas are different. So it is reasonable to consolidate them in different organization and have a national petroleum company which takes care of one, and national minerals company which takes care of the other one. And I think this is the direction the government is going, to create Kumu Petroleum and Kumu Minerals. One would be the National Petroleum Corporation of Papua New Guinea, and one which would take care of the mineral side. This, I think, has huge benefits for Papua New Guinea, as the players outside know who they're dealing with. The players inside know how to consolidate, and the synergies of the size and different operations can lead to better financing, to better management, and to more ease in developing the projects and going forward.
Do you see any problems arising from this?
I think this is a problem solved, frankly, that if you don't do it like this, you have a problem. But I think that the direction is the right direction, and it will lead to very positive results. Consolidation is the key. Specialization is the key. If you divide up assets among different players, then different players come and go. Their influence in the government changes, their role changes, and we need to have legislation backing up these institutions so that then they cannot be changed in the future. This direction needs to be a permanent direction set, and I think this is the direction that the government has chosen, to create these long-term permanent structures.
So only good outcomes for the development of PNG resources?
I think recent policies are very positive, among the most positive I've seen in decades, and I have watched PNG for 3 decades. So I'm very hopeful that these will result in a takeoff, at least, of the petroleum industry. By that I mean essentially gas industry, and develop it in such a way which will change the future of the country.
Thank you very much for your time today, Dr. Fesharaki. That was Dr. Feridun Fesharaki, a global expert in LNG and the petroleum sector.
An interview with the International Finance Corporation. That's next. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us on Resource PNG. We now join Gavin Murray, Country Manager of Australia, New Zealand, Timor-Leste, PNG and the Pacific Islands International Finance Corporation, World Bank Group. We hear Gavin's comparison of PNG's energy developments to similar regions. We hear his view of the state partnering with independent power producers and the delivery of large-scale energy and off-scale energy projects.
Gavin, how would you compare PNG's energy developments to similar regions in Asia?
Well, I think, Ananya, one of the reasons we're talking about this today is because the access to electricity in Papua New Guinea is so low. And so it does compare at the bottom end of the scale, unfortunately, when you look at other countries around the region. I think the opportunity or the need is to look at how do we move that forward. So right now, only about between 10 and 15% of Papua New Guineans have access to reliable electricity, and those that don't are relying on expensive and costly methods that are not reliable. So we believe that there are comparators around the region where we can learn lessons from what you could do in Papua New Guinea. And an example that we were talking about earlier today is Laos in Asia, the Laos People's Democratic Republic of Laos. Where in 1995 they only had about 16% access to electricity for their population, and it's a very similar country. It has about 6 million people compared to Papua New Guinea is 7 million. It's similar in geographic sort of terrain and also demographics. There's a lot of rural people. So their solution was to look at a systematic way of addressing their need, and they were able to do that both through large hydro projects but also through off-grid small projects. And what they found, importantly, is where they did provide access to electricity at a village level, that also incentivised people to start small business. So there's a whole economic flow on from providing people with access to electricity.
Is that type of strategy applicable here, do you think?
Well, we believe it is, and we think it's unfortunate that at the moment the various different initiatives that are going on in Papua New Guinea are not perhaps better linked. And there's efforts focused on the areas within the grids and the two main grids in the north and the south of the country, and also initiatives being operated in Western Province by Western Power to look at off-grid solutions. And we think there's an opportunity to look at how to bring all of those together and address the critical need of giving people access to power, both through small business models that can be applied in the rural areas, as well as more efficient and reliable and sustainable energy at the commercial end.
Right. What's your opinion on independent power producers partnering with our state authority here?
Right. So IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, and so we're very used to working with the private sector and coming up with models working with the private sector for them to be able to provide public services and deliver public goods. And I think certainly the government here has been working with the Asian Development Bank on establishing a framework for public-private partnerships, and that's really what enables IPPs to be, or independent private power projects to proceed. So right at the moment the PNG Power is looking at, has gone out and looking at developing some IPPs for both Port Moresby and for Lae, and I also believe a smaller project in Png Lng. So these things are already happening, and I think that is a way forward, but it also needs to be done, at a larger scale, looking at not just within the existing systems but outside of those systems, so you can also attract perhaps other people who have got different business models and different solutions, renewable energy and the like, to come in and pilot things in Papua New Guinea.
Right. What's the IFC's commitment to the PNG's energy sector?
It's a very good question, Ananya, because when we started scaling up our activities about 4 years ago in the Pacific, and obviously Papua New Guinea is a very large part of that, we were looking at the sectors where there was a real private sector activity and opportunity. And so initially we were not really interested in power per se, except for the opportunity to look at bringing in the private sector into larger generation opportunities. But through a process of re-evaluating our strategy in Papua New Guinea, we decided that we couldn't ignore access to electricity because it is such a fundamental element of economic development and to grow the private sector. You need safe, reliable, affordable energy. So we decided as part of our strategy is to look at refocusing some of our effort on energy and access to electricity, and made a commitment that we would look to try to play a role in doubling access to electricity by 2015. So our focus now is both at the sector level, and we do that with our partners like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the government, looking at what sector reforms are needed to enable new energy and energy access, but also at firm level, so working with existing businesses. And an example of that is some work that we're piloting with Digicel, which is using recharging, solar recharging stations that at a village level that can also be used for street lighting or lighting of an area. So it provides a safety element to it as well. So that is a way of using an existing corporate company that is active and has a distribution network to get some of these, trying new ideas and new systems out into the community. Right. So we see that as an important project that we're working on. But we do believe that there is opportunity for other activities, and building on some of the experience that's being tried and worked on in Western Province and elsewhere, where you're looking at small hydro systems, as well as solar power, and even biomass, some small biomass projects.
Right, right. How will you deliver large-scale energy projects and off-grid energy projects?
Well, I gave some examples where we worked in the Philippines on a large hydro project. It was the first of its type that was structured, and IFC can play a role in arranging and helping structure those transactions, so that we can bring in other lenders and also bring in the local financial institutions to support that. You know, in Papua New Guinea, you do have the pension funds and the superannuation funds and the provident funds, and they are a large source of local capital. They are looking for long-term returns for their investors, and some of these projects are natural fit for those investors, but they don't necessarily have the capacity to structure an investment into a large power transaction. So we believe that we can play that role and work with the private sector and others in working out the best structure and how to get the necessary investment into these large projects. We also bring our environmental and social standards, which we think are very important in terms of getting these projects right from the start, so that they are in long term in protect the assets of the country. And finally, we are able to bring some of our global expertise and knowledge and things that we've tried elsewhere that we know have worked or haven't worked, as well as partners that we have elsewhere in the world that we may be able to bring to a country like Papua New Guinea who would not normally come here.
Right. Thank you for your time today, Gavin.
Thank you very much, Ananya.
Gavin Murray, the Country Manager, Pacific Region for the IFC.
Png Lng Updates, that's next. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Resource PNG. If you've just joined, so far on the show we've featured an interview with the chairman of Fax Global Energy and global LNG expert Dr. Feridun Fesharaki. We've also heard about IFC's energy projects in the country. We now have the latest Png Lng updates delivered in a presentation by Managing Director of Esso Highlands, Peter Graham.
The first gas scheduled for next year, we're confident that we're very much on track to meet our commitments to our buyers, to government, community stakeholders and project participants. By any measure, the scope of the project, like the Png Lng project, is large. By the time the project's complete, more than 700 kilometres of pipeline will link the gas resources in the Southern Highlands area to a liquefaction, storage and marine facility some 20 kilometres northwest of Port Moresby. Just to give you an idea about how large the project is, the weight of steel in the pipeline is almost the equivalent to the amount of steel found in 11 Sydney Harbour bridges. At the liquefaction plant, ships will berth at a 2.4 kilometre long jetty to be loaded with liquefied natural gas, which will be stored in two large liquefied gas storage tanks, each wide enough and tall enough to hold a Boeing 747 plane. To house project workers, we built camps that have the capacity for around 17,000 people. At the LNG plant site alone, we serve around 25,000 meals a day, using around 8 tonnes of meat and about 25,000 eggs a day. This picture is probably a little bit deceptive. I'd hate to give the impression we cook one egg at a time. So what's the current status of the project? Today we've got something like 19,000 people currently working on the project. At peak it was more like 21,000, but today it's about 19. For many of our Papua New Guinean workers, this is their first foray into work, particularly in the resources sector. To support them, we've invested some 1.6 million hours of training and 280 million kina in training to help them develop the skills necessary to construct the project. Much has been accomplished to date. Let me just go through a few slides to give you an indication of progress. At Hides, first off, where we'll be producing about 1 billion standard cubic feet a day of gas, foundations are essentially complete, and equipment and pipework is now being installed. The large components that will go to make up the plant will shortly be flown into Como airfield and transported the final 20 kilometres by road from the airfield to the Hides gas conditioning plant. The drill rig, meanwhile, we're continuing our drilling program. We very recently commissioned our second drill rig, rig 703, and begun drilling at the second well pad C on Hides Ridge. At Como, we're completing the final section of the 3.2 kilometre runway. I guess to put that in perspective, I think Jackson's is about 2.8 kilometres long. Como airfield is 3.2 kilometres long. Como is instrumented and has cargo and passenger handling facilities. Deliveries of project equipment via the Antonov aircraft are scheduled to begin in early May. And you'll start to see the aircraft coming in to be loaded in Port Moresby, just down the road below us. And it should be a spectacular sight watching the first Antonov come into land in the Highlands area. After delivery of the project components for Hides, the airfield will be used for passenger movements during the ongoing production phase of the project for the next 30 years or so. Discussions have been initiated with the state on possible sharing as a commercial airport, but a decision is yet to be made on how the airfield will be used longer term. Moving south, our contractors have completed welding on almost 260 kilometres of the onshore pipeline. Around 200 kilometres of that pipeline has already been hydro-tested, or in other words, tested for leaks. Construction activities are progressing from both the north and south directions at this point in time, and will eventually meet between Homer, the village of Homer, and the Hides gas conditioning plant. This is truly pioneering work. If you've ever flown up in that part of the world and had a look at the terrain, I think you'd appreciate just how difficult a task it is to lay 32-inch diameter pipe up and down some of the mountains and across streams. So we're creating a pipeline right away up those mountains and across ridges and across rivers in very remote areas where there are no existing roads. I should add that this photograph shows the pipeline above ground. When it's complete, it'll be buried underground. The offshore pipeline is complete and runs underwater from the Amati River Delta to the LNG plant. It too has been hydro-tested, and it's now connected at both ends to the onshore pipeline and the LNG plant. Turning to the LNG plant itself, some of you will get an opportunity to see the progress of the plant for yourselves tomorrow. I'd like to just clarify that the 50 kina charge is not an entrance fee for a visit to the plant, although it does give me some ideas about how we might offset capital cost. All of the major equipment at the LNG plant is installed, and we've completed welding on all 120 pipe rack modules along the LNG jetty, as well as hydro-tested the LNG tanks. So we're now progressively energising the substations and local equipment rooms for commissioning, and ramping up commissioning activities in the utilities area, power and water. The tie-in for the gas pipeline is complete, as I mentioned previously, and we're about to commence nitrogen purging of the pipeline up to Kutubu in preparation for introduction of commissioning gas later this year. So the project, from our perspective, is at a particularly exciting stage. We can see the end point. Work's ramping up in preparing for the start-up next year. For the past 3 years or so, we've had a substantial organisation also working on what we call building the producing organisation. It's one thing to build the plant, it's another to be ready to operate it successfully and with integrity for the next 30 years. So we've been preparing for this transition from construction to operations. Our operating teams are completing their training and competency assessments, and our experienced expat staff, operations personnel, are mentoring our Papua New Guinean employees who will eventually take over and run the site for the life of the facilities.
More Png LNG updates after the break. Welcome back to the show. We continue the presentation of the Png LNG updates with the Managing Director of Esso Highlands, Peter Graham.
Having talked now briefly about the scope of the project, let me return to the theme of this particular presentation, which is infrastructure, time for action. Our focus has been on the project, establishing the infrastructure needed to deliver the project on schedule. Not surprisingly, a project of this scale has tested the capacity of existing infrastructure and processes in Papua New Guinea. I expect that our peak demands may have had adverse impacts on some of you in the audience today as users of public infrastructure, something we've been very conscious of and something we've tried to mitigate wherever possible, either through scheduling of our needs for infrastructure and through investment in building capacity in Papua New Guinea. Logistics has been one of our most challenging issues on the project itself, particularly for the construction of the upstream part of the project, the onshore pipeline and the gas conditioning plant at Hides. To meet the construction needs at Hides in the Highlands, the project's been averaging around 600 truckloads of materials and equipment a month along the Highlands Highway, 800 and something kilometres from Lae out to Hides. It's a tough job given the terrain and the conditions of the Highlands Highway. Significant investment's been put into the Highlands Highway in 2010. We funded a 4.3 million kina study by engineering procurement construction contractor Bechtel to develop a 20-year plan for the progressive upgrade of the Highlands Highway, aligned with the state's Vision 2050 and the medium-term development plan. This study included the development of engineering packages for the first 5 years to enable the government to quickly begin repair work on sections that required immediate attention. The study and the detailed engineering packages have been handed to the government, specifically the Department of Works. We understand that this study has been used by the government recently in seeking funding for the Highlands Highway rehabilitation projects. The project's invested over 320 million kina in road upgrades and maintenance on the Highlands Highway in the last several years, including replacement of 6 bridges and strengthening another 16 bridges between Mendi and Hides. We've also handed over to the government an additional 15 prefabricated bridges to install as part of the government's longer-term bridge replacement program on the highway. We recognise the impact of the project on some of the infrastructure in the country and have an ongoing program for maintenance and repair with the Department of Works through 2013 for the Highlands Highway. With the investments that we in the state have made, we're very pleased to see that the Highlands Highway was open around 95% of the time last year, versus an historical average that's probably more like 70%. This has had positive implications not just for the project, but for the many other people who are regular users of this infrastructure each and every day. I guess we're now past our peak, logistics peak on the Highlands Highway. The project loads along the highway have significantly reduced, and the stresses on the highway likewise will be reduced. The onshore pipeline is being constructed from the south to the north, from the Amati River Delta up to Hydes. More than 195,000 tonnes of steel pipe were transshipped onto barges in the Kakori River and transported to a newly constructed wharf and laydown facility in Kopi. From here, the 12-metre lengths of pipe have been strung out for a distance of almost 300 kilometres to Hydes. For the most part, there were no through roads and several major rivers and multi-creek crossings to be crossed. 2 major bridges were constructed as part of our infrastructure work across the Moobi and the Kakori rivers. What we've constructed, though, is along the onshore pipeline is what we would call a right-of-way. It's not a road from the Gulf to the Southern Highlands. Project lenders, the folks who've lent significant amounts of money to the project venturers, are concerned about improved access, facilitating migration of people and illegal logging of old-growth forests. The lenders require that this not become a road. Not unexpectedly, the state would like to see access opened up between the Highlands and the Gulf. And I think those of you who were present on the start of this conference heard the Prime Minister comment on just that he's committed to finding ways to open up that infrastructure to allow movement of people and goods and materials down from the Highlands to the Gulf area. So more to come, I think, in that particular space.
More on the presentation after the break. In this last segment of the show, from Peter Graham's presentation, we hear about what the Png Lng project is doing in terms of telecommunications and infrastructure projects.
I'd like to talk briefly about telecommunications and other infrastructure area. While we were working on the project's telecommunication needs, an interesting opportunity arose to open up a backbone of fibre optic cable for the nation. Our project telecommunication plan identified fibre optic cable from Hydes down to the LNG plant in Port Moresby. We recognised an opportunity over the time for participation by third parties to share the costs, but also share the benefits of having that fibre laid. Most of the cost of fibre optic telecommunications is in the installation rather than the cable itself. And we could complete the installation of the cable as we laid the pipe. So an agreement was reached with IPBC, with Oil Search, the Southern Highlands Provincial Government to install a 750-kilometre fibre optic cable the entire length of the Png Lng pipeline from Port Moresby up to Hydes. The offshore section, which follows the route of the offshore pipeline, has just recently been finished. While this cable will improve telecommunications for long-term operations for the project, there are clear benefits for the nation as high-speed telecommunications are opened up across a broad swath of Papua New Guinea. Should the state complete the link between Hydes and across to Lae Madang, that would open up a huge loop of telecommunications right across the nation. Turning to project construction in the Highlands, logistics would prove to be a critical factor in our planning for execution of the project. Initial thinking was to share the south-north pipeline right-of-way to deliver equipment up to Hydes. But considerations of the terrain, regular flooding, and competition between the likely uses of that right-of-way rendered this approach impractical. The Highlands Highway from Lae to Hydes was notoriously unreliable due to terrain, landslips, security, and capacity of the roads and bridges. Many of the bridges were derated to be lower capacity than what you would normally expect on a highway. Ultimately, we chose a combination of the Highlands Highway, an air bridge to Tari Airport, along with the construction of a new airfield at Como to allow the large components to be flown in. At Tari Airport, a government facility, the project invested about 20 million kina in a number of upgrades, including repairs to the runway and upgrades to passenger facilities. some 2,700 loads have been delivered by the L100 Hercules-size aircraft into Taree for transshipment from there to Hydes. Infrastructure demands for the LNG plant itself, which is only 20 kilometres old outside of Port Moresby, have obviously been less challenging than those in the Highlands. Almost all the sea freight was delivered over the privately owned Murdochia Island facility, significantly reducing the stress on PNG port facilities in downtown Port Moresby. The project constructed a road from Murdochia Island out to the LNG plant site itself to allow haulage of materials and equipment that distance. The road was designed to allow haulage of the largest single load at 542 tonnes and the longest load at 53 metres. So clearly a pretty significant engineering design for this particular road. The road's since been transferred to the Department of Works as public infrastructure and provides much improved access to Port Moresby for the 4 villages in the vicinity of the LNG plant site. So far I've talked about project-funded infrastructure. So Islands is also engaged in with various arms of government to help capture real value from the 1.2 billion kina that's been committed to infrastructure development under the 10-year commitment under the umbrella benefit sharing agreement struck with landowners throughout the project impacted area by the state. Historically, these grants have been disbursed as cash. There's comparatively little to show in the way of infrastructure at local levels throughout the project area. We've offered to provide engineering support and contracting and construction oversight to improve the delivery of these infrastructure projects and in the process to build capacity within government to deliver such projects. We're also helping the newly formed Hela provincial government design townships and growth centres for Hydes, Como, Ngoli. And we'll also look at designs for other areas such as Homapawa, Panaria and Awatangi. I'd like now to turn very briefly to talk about another area of infrastructure capacity building, and that's the area that you might call human infrastructure. We've invested significantly in education, training, building and operating 2 residential training facilities at a cost of around 170 million kina, one here in Port Moresby and one up in the Highlands. These 2 vocational training facilities have seen some 1,700 Papua New Guineans trained in construction skills to an international standard. With construction training nearing completion, we're now assessing long-term options for these facilities, including delivering them to the state for future vocational training and educational initiatives. We've also invested in working with various government departments to help build their capacity to respond to the needs of projects of our size. For example, we've developed a strong partnership with the Department of Works. The department has shown a commitment to proactively approaching challenges and improving infrastructure between Lae and Hydes. We brought in specialists, for example, to instruct Department of Works staff and Defence Force engineering personnel in how to install prefabricated unibridges that we've constructed along the Highlands Highway. We've additionally worked with the Department of Labour and Industrial Relations, Immigration and Customs to deal with the huge numbers of people and loads of equipment coming into the country as part of the project. While this may at times have impacted other businesses, the state has developed processes and a capacity, we believe, that will benefit everyone in the longer term. Given this brief look at the scale and scope of the project, its infrastructure needs are readily apparent. In addition, the nature of the infrastructure challenges we place a need for solutions that simultaneously support project needs while protecting the country's unique biodiversity and cultural heritage. As we look forward to first gas delivery in 2014 and beyond, the infrastructure that we've expanded by construction as part of the LNG project can serve as a model and a foundation for ongoing infrastructure development in the country. Through the lens of the PNG LNG project, public infrastructure limitations have required substantial investment and effort to deliver the project on schedule. Unquestionably, industrial developments in PNG are being challenged by infrastructure limitations, which often simply become a cost of doing business. The government has recognised this fact, and we're encouraged that the government is committed to addressing priority infrastructure at the national and local levels. A critical focus on infrastructure for moving development from the planning to the implementation stage is clearly essential. This is going to require, under government leadership, the concerted effort and collaboration by all stakeholders to achieve it in a manner that best serves the needs of Papua New Guineans. SO Highlands Limited remains committed to playing its part, positive part, and a proactive role in developing PNG's future. Thank you very much.
That's all we have for tonight on Resource PNG. For any comments or queries, do email us on this address, resourcepng@mtv.com.pg. Or to find out more, check MTV online, that's www.mtv.com.pg, and go to our Resource PNG page. Until another edition of Resource PNG, have a pleasant evening.